Good morning, everyone. I'm Barbara Vanich, Chief Auditor and Director of Professional Standards at the PCAOB, and it's my pleasure to be with you today. I would like to welcome you to this meeting of the Standards and Emerging Issues Advisory Group of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. I would like to welcome our members, observers, board members, and the public watching this meeting. We have a full agenda today. This morning, you will be primarily hearing from us. First, Chair Williams will make a few remarks, and then I will provide a brief standard setting update. After that, the Office of Economic and Risk Analysis will provide you with an update on our post-implementation reviews of critical audit matters and estimates and specialist standards. After lunch, we hope primarily to hear from you. First, we have a session on going concern, and then we'll talk about substantive analytical procedures. In addition, the board has approved the formation of a 5-member Emerging Issues and Auditing Subcommittee. The subcommittee would be comprised of 1 accounting representative, 1 auditing representative, 1 corporate governance representative, 1 investor or investor advocate representative, and 1 at-large representative, such as our academics. We plan to wrap up the public meeting slightly ahead of schedule with the hope that we can select and vote on members today. Advisory group members can self-nominate or nominate other members of the advisory group, after which SEIAG members will vote on the nominees. So turning back to our agenda, we built in plenty of time for your comments throughout the meeting. As a reminder, if you would like to say something, use the raise your hand function. If that's not working, please just type something in the chat function. We'll try to call on you in the order hands are raised, and thank you in advance for your patience. If you have any technical difficulties during the meeting, please reach out to Brian Goodnaw. And now my final responsibility here, although others may repeat it, is to state that for all representatives of the PCAOB speaking at today's meeting, the views expressed by each of the presenters are their own views and do not necessarily reflect the views of the board or other board members or staff. As mentioned, Chair Williams has some opening remarks. If you don't mind, please hold questions or comments until after the standard setting update. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chair Williams.
Thank you, Barb, and thank you to members of the Standards and Emerging Issues Advisory Group for convening this important discussion on our standard setting agenda. Before we begin, I understand that recent bank failures may be top of mind for many of you. The PCAOB is acutely aware of concerns from investors, and I know there are outstanding questions that must be answered. But today's meeting is not a forum for providing those answers, and it's important that we avoid speculation. As you know, the PCAOB is prohibited from discussing specific inspection and enforcement matters, including whether or not enforcement matters or investigations have been initiated. As a general matter, the PCAOB carefully monitors registered firms and will not hesitate to take action when rules or standards are violated. Without speaking to any individual entity or person, as I've said many times, the PCAOB is using every tool in our enforcement toolbox to pursue wrongdoing wherever we find it and impose significant sanctions against those who put investors at risk. The purpose of today's meeting is to update you on our standard setting activities and get feedback on specific standard setting projects as we continue to pursue the most ambitious standard setting agenda in PCAOB history. Last year, we completed our project on supervision of other auditors and proposed new standards on confirmation and quality control. And earlier this week, we proposed a new standard and related amendments on our AS1000 project. Today, you will hear an update of our post-implementation review of critical audit matters and estimates and specialists. We will also discuss and obtain feedback from you on 2 projects on our standard setting agenda, Going Concern, which is one on our short-term projects, and Substantive Analytical Procedures, which is a midterm standard setting project. These are 2 of the 10 standard setting agenda projects we are working on that directly affect more than 30 standards. I want to thank Barb and her team who are working tirelessly to move our standard setting agenda forward, along with the help of Mike Gerbert in our Office of Economic and Research and Analysis, and all of our stakeholders whose comments help inform our standards. Standards are the foundation for quality audits, and quality audits protect people. Now I'd like to turn the meeting back over to Barb to get us started with the first item on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Williams. So I'll start with this week's board action, which was issuing for public comment a proposal related to the general responsibilities of the auditor, which I'll refer to as AS 1000. The general principles and responsibilities of the auditor include reasonable assurance, due professional care, professional skepticism, independence, competence, and professional judgment. These principles and related responsibilities provide a foundation for the proper performance of an audit, apply to all audits, and therefore are important to audit quality and investor protection. As I've mentioned before, this project represents the first project stemming from the work of our interim standards team. Currently, the general principles and responsibilities are addressed across 4 interim standards adopted by the PCAOB back in 2003. And those include AS 1001, Responsibilities and Functions of the Independent Auditor, AS 1005, Independence, AS 1010, Training and Proficiency of the Independent Auditor, and AS 1015, Due Professional Care in the Performance of Work. Now, the proposal would reorganize and combine the general principles and responsibilities into one standard, AS 1000. It would reflect changes in the auditing environment, eliminate outdated and inconsistent language, and increase consistency with other board-issued standards. Through this proposal, we would remind auditors of the fundamental obligation to the public by serving as the protector of the public interest and in the integrity of financial statements. Additionally, the proposal includes amendments to other standards that address responsibilities that are fundamental to the conduct of the audit. In developing this proposal, we considered changes in the auditing environment since the adoption of the foundational standards, including changes to audit requirements through board-issued standards, new or revised independence rules issued by the board, and also advances in technology affecting the audit. We believe that the proposal aligns with the board's strategic plan to modernize and streamline the existing standards. As mentioned, the proposed standard retains the general principles and responsibilities and clarifies certain related provisions. For example, with respect to requirements on independence, the proposed standard expresses the auditor's obligation to be independent by referring to the PCAOB's independence rules and standards and the SEC's independence rules. The proposed standard also describes the auditor's obligation to comply with ethics requirements, to obtain and maintain competence, and prepare audit documentation. While these responsibilities aren't new, the proposed standard provides more specificity around how the auditor complies with these requirements. For example, the proposed standard states that the auditor is required to develop and maintain competence through an appropriate combination of academic education, professional experience in accounting and auditing with proper supervision, and training, including auditing, accounting, independence, ethics, and other relevant continuing professional education. Similar to the foundational standards, the proposed standard addresses the auditor's responsibility for due professional care and professional skepticism. The standard reaffirms the meaning of these important principles, describes responsibilities related to professional judgment, and provides additional clarification with respect to the engagement partner's responsibility for exercising due professional care. This includes more directly aligning with the partner's existing responsibilities for supervision and review, along with the exercise of due professional care. Lastly, the proposed standard retains and clarifies the auditor's fundamental responsibilities for conducting an audit, including obtaining reasonable assurance, complying with the applicable professional and legal requirements, and making required communications. In addition to reinforcing these important principles, we believe that these clarifications will make the proposed standard easier to read, understand, and apply. The proposal also includes important proposed amendments to other standards that address responsibilities fundamental to the conduct of an audit. The first of these amendments relates to the engagement partner's existing responsibilities for supervision and review. The proposed amendments clarify the extent of planning, supervisory, review, and documentation activities to be performed by the engagement partner as part of exercising due professional care. The proposed amendments clarify that when the engagement partner seeks assistance from appropriate engagement team members, the engagement partner retains the primary responsibility for the engagement and its performance. The proposed amendments also specify that as part of exercising due professional care, the engagement partner is required to review sufficient documentation to determine that the engagement was performed as planned, significant judgments were appropriate, and significant findings and issues were appropriately addressed. The conclusions expressed in the auditor's report are appropriate and supported by sufficient appropriate evidence, and matters requiring communication under applicable professional and legal requirements are appropriately identified and communicated. The proposed amendments further provides that the engagement partner's review includes review of documentation of significant findings or issues and the review of documentation that is also subject to review by the engagement quality reviewer. The proposed amendments emphasize that the engagement partner and other engagement team members performing supervisory activities are also required to complete their review of audit documentation prior to the report release date. We believe that the engagement partner's review of audit documentation is also an important part of supervision. Lastly, the proposed amendments clarify the requirements for audit documentation to identify who performed the work, who reviewed the work, and the date of that review. We believe these amendments clarify the engagement partner's existing obligations for supervision and review as the engagement team member with primary responsibility for the engagement. The next proposed amendment I'd like to mention relates to assembling a complete and final set of audit documentation. Currently, audit work needs to be completed prior to the issuance of the audit report. However, existing provisions on documenting and reviewing the performance of audit procedures require the auditor to complete audit documentation within 45 days of releasing the auditor's report. That provision was adopted by the board almost 20 years ago, prior to the more widespread use of electronic documentation and when a significant amount of audit evidence was still in paper form. Given the importance of audit documentation to the conduct of an audit, the proposal includes an amendment to accelerate the documentation completion date by reducing the maximum period for the auditor to assemble a complete and final set of audit documentation from 45 days to 14 days. We believe that an accelerated documentation completion date reflects changes in the auditing environment, including advancements in technology that have enabled auditors to assemble a complete and final set of documentation in less time. The comment period is open for 60 days through May 30th. Since the last SEIAG meeting, as Erica mentioned, as you know, the board has issued proposals on quality control and on our confirmations project. Thank you to those of you who were part of the comment process. We received 43 comment letters on our quality control proposal and 47 comment letters on our confirmations proposal. Our teams are analyzing the letters and will be working with the board in the upcoming months on the decisions to be made as we move forward with those projects. Since the last SEIAG meeting, we've also continued to work with the board on other short-term standard setting projects. From an ordering perspective, currently we anticipate making recommendations to the board on no-CLAR first, and then on the amendments related to the use of data analysis and going concern after that. And we're certainly looking forward to hearing your input on going concern later today. We're also starting to engage more with the board on some of the midterm projects, and as I've mentioned before, as we make progress, we'll consider when to move those projects to the short-term agenda. And with that, we're looking forward also to your input on our discussion of substantive analytical procedures. Since we last met, we've done some additional outreach on our fraud project, and we've also been thinking about the nexus of the fraud standard and our project on non-compliance with laws and regulations, since financial statement fraud is an example of non-compliance with laws and regulations. We were benefited greatly by a panel on fraud that occurred at our last investor advisory group where we certainly heard some interesting and very helpful perspectives. And based on our initial work completed to date by our interim standards team, we're starting to assign our project team's secondary projects. And in the upcoming months, I expect that we'll be adding additional projects to the midterm agenda when we update the agenda in a month or two, and then again later in the fall. And we look forward to discussing some of these other standards with you at upcoming meetings. We've also continued to progress our research project on firm and engagement metrics. And from a research perspective, our team has analyzed input from the last discussion we had with you and also our discussion with our investor advisory group. We've considered comment letters on the board strategic plan and on the QC proposal that address those types of metrics. We've reviewed firm publications for the top 20 US firms. Our colleagues from the Office of Economic and Research and Risk Analysis have identified and synthesized hundreds of academic papers. Our additional analysis has provided us with valuable insights to further shape this project, and we look forward to working with the board in upcoming months on next steps. So stay tuned for that. That concludes my prepared remarks, and I'll turn over to Jessica to see if there are any raised hands.
Not yet.
Okay. Well, with that, let's turn to the next topic on the agenda, which is the post-implementation review update on our work on critical audit matters and estimates and specialist post-implementation reviews. We plan to spend the next 45 minutes providing an update. Today, we're joined by Michael Gerbit, Wei Shi, and Carrie Von Bose of the Office of Economics and Risk Analysis. Michael, would you and the team please proceed?
Thanks, Bob, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for the time today. So we're going to talk economic research this morning, and specifically large sample statistical analysis of PCAOB inspections data, our analysis of third-party data, our review of academic research and our web-based surveys, structured interviews and questionnaires of stakeholders that collectively all come together to inform our post-implementation review process at PCAOB. As Bob said, I'm joined today by two of our terrific ERA staff. They'll deliver today's briefing. I'm joined by Dr. Wei Shi. Wei leads our post-implementation review team at PCAOB. And additionally, I'm joined by Dr. Carrie Von Bose. Carrie leads development of our stakeholder outreach-based research. And that research, as you'll hear, is a key part of our program. It complements our statistical analysis of inspections and third-party data. And importantly, it ensures that we understand how stakeholders are experiencing our standards. Wei and Carrie are going to walk through findings from two projects this morning. We'll start with our analysis on the initial impacts of critical audit matter requirements. And after that, we'll pivot to the results of our analysis on the initial impacts of new requirements for auditing accounting estimates and auditors' use of the work of specialists. We're also planning to use some of the time today to ask for feedback on our work. And so Wei and Carrie will tee up some discussion questions for us at the end. And those are intended to obtain your views on where we might focus our research efforts as we go forward. So again, we'll take questions and comments at the end, but for now, Wei and Carrie will take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everyone. My name is Wei Shi, and I'm from the Office of Economic and Risk Analysis here at the PCAOB. For today's presentation, I'll start by providing a quick overview of the objectives of our PIR program and the methods that we generally use in our analysis. This introduction may sound familiar to you, as Mike also talked about it in the previous SEIAG meeting in November 2022, but because we were throwing a lot of information at you during that presentation, and also because it provides a framework for the rest of the discussion today, I think it would be useful and helpful to very briefly review with you. We will then share with you our findings from the two recent interim analysis that we conducted for the CAM requirement, as well as for the estimates and specialist requirement. The final products of these two analyses are two reports and 4 supporting staff white paper, and they were published on our PCAOB website in early December last year. So let me start with the PIR objectives and our methods. We conduct post-implementation review of new or newly revised standards or rules to see if those new requirements are doing what they're supposed to be doing or could be doing it better. Essentially, we want to answer the following questions through our analysis. First of all, are we seeing the benefits in the rule, including the benefit we expected to see or benefits that perhaps were more surprising? We also want to see how costly was the rule to implement. What was the cost to the big firm? What was the cost to the small firm? What portion of the costs were fixed versus variable? And do we see cost implications for different sizes or different types of issuers? And finally, are we seeing evidence that point us to unintended consequences? So in sum, PIR essentially complement the economic analysis developed and conducted during the rulemaking stage by providing the board with a second opportunity to look at the overall effect of the rule or the standard with the added benefit of access to new data from the implementation period itself. As we perform our work, we go about evaluating impact using a few different methods. First of all, we might interview people who are affected by the implementation. Sometimes that is through a structured conversation. Other times, we might use a data collection tool, such as a web-based survey, questionnaire to gather data from a potentially larger pool of respondents. We also looked at whether hard quantitative data is available, either to provide descriptive statistics on changes in the audit process over time, or where possible to perform more causal econometric analysis to attribute those changes to a specific rulemaking. Finally, of course, another option that is open to us is to issue a formal public request for comment. Once we have done our analysis, at that point, we would typically prepare a board report to summarize the key findings and potential next steps. Additionally, we would typically issue one or more supporting staff white papers. These white papers would set forth the analysis and the findings in greater detail and, importantly, consistent with the best practice, provide transparency into our research methodology, as well as other more technical aspects of our analysis and findings. As a general rule, post-implementation review take place generally several years after the rule's effective date. Standards may take, at a minimum, at least a couple of years to fully bed in. And so because of that, attempting to evaluate the impact too early could result in us missing important effects. On the other hand, an interim analysis can be performed at a much earlier stage. And in fact, that's what we typically do. Of course, an interim analysis generates only preliminary findings, but nevertheless, it can also serve as a useful early warnings of, for example, benefits not being achieved, costs being greater than expected, or possibly the presence of unexpected effects. Moreover, because it can take some lead time to develop any regulatory responses, this kind of early temperature check on the effectiveness of the implementation can be very helpful. As I said, for today, our focus will be on the two recent interim analyses that we conducted, one on CAM requirement, the other one on estimate specialist. So let me start then with the interim analysis for the CAM requirement. But first, I'll provide a very quick refresher about the CAM requirement. CAM communication are intended to inform investor and other financial statement users about matters that require especially challenging, subjective, or complex auditor judgment, and the responses that the auditor had to those matters. CAM requirements feature a phased implementation. Specifically, they took effect in June 2019 for a large accelerated filer with the LAF for short. And then 18 months later, in December 2020, they became effective for audits of all other companies to which the standard applied. In light of this phased implementation in October 2020, and as directed by the SEC, the PCAOB issued an initial interim analysis on CAMs, focused specifically on the initial impact of the CAM implementation on LAF audits. The second interim analysis, which was just published in December last year, discussed more recent development in CAM communication, including the second year of experience for large accelerated filers, and provided additional insights and perspective following the implementation of CAM requirement by the auditors of smaller issuers. So we essentially conducted these interim analysis to gain initial understanding of a few things. One, we want to understand auditors' responses to the CAM requirement. Two, we want to understand investors' use of CAM communication. And three, we want to understand audit committee chairs and financial statement preparers' experience related to their auditors' implementation of the CAM requirement. In our analysis, we also evaluated whether early evidence from initial implementation of the CAM requirement was subjective of significant cost, benefit, or unintended consequences. As I mentioned a few slides earlier, we evaluated impact through stakeholder outreach and a large sample data analysis. In our stakeholder outreach for CAM, we basically wanted to first understand the initiative audit firm put in place to support implementation. We want to understand the associated costs with the implementation and any challenges encountered by the auditor. Here, we also looked at the changes audit firm made to their CAM-related processes in year 2 of the implementation and evaluated any differences in small versus large firm implementation approaches. Second, we wanted to assess how the CAM requirement impacted individual audits. This encompassed understanding how engagement team experiences changed in the second year of implementation for auditor of LAF and how the impact of the CAM requirement on audits of non-LAF may have differed from impacts on LAF audits. Third, we wanted to understand issuer experiences with the CAM implementation. In our most recent analysis, this included evaluating non-LAF experiences with their initial CAM implementation and understanding how LAF experiences may have changed in the second year of the CAM communication. And then finally, and importantly, we sought to evaluate investors' use and perceptions of the CAM communication. For example, we wanted to know if and how investors use CAMs today and understanding their views on the utility of the information and how it could be improved. So how do we go about evaluating these things? So number one, we sent out questionnaire to survey 18 different audit firms. We also perform web-based surveys of audit engagement partners. We gather 920 complete survey responses in 2022 and slightly more than 900 complete responses in year 2020. We also interview a total number of 43 audit committee chairs as well as financial statement preparers. And then we perform 2 web-based surveys of investors who conduct fundamental or governance analysis of company, gathering 150 complete responses. And again, here we focus on investors who do fundamental and or governance analysis of company, because in our opinion, these are the investors who are most likely to have rec cams. In addition to the stakeholder outreach, we also used PCAOB inspection data and external third-party data to monitor the development in CAM communications and evaluate impacts. Excuse me. At a high level, our analysis in this area comprised of two main elements. Number one, we developed descriptive statistics that summarize the key trends and development in CAM communications. Number two, we perform econometric analysis to evaluate the effect of CAM communication on several outcomes of interest. For example, these outcomes included how investors respond to the CAM communication and the impact of CAMs on audit hours and audit fees. So overall, what did we find? I would talk about the high-level key findings here today, and the reports and the white paper I mentioned earlier on our PCAOB website contain further detail if you're interested. Starting with the trends in CAM communications, we see that the average number of CAMs per audit report has declined over time, and the proportion of audit reports that communicate a single CAM has increased. For example, among the LAF audits, the average number of CAMs per report went from 1.69 in year 1 to 1.43 in year 3. Similarly, for non-LAF audits, the drop is from 1.23 in year 1 to 1.12 in year 2. We also found that compared to the first investor survey we performed in year 2020, investors' awareness of CAM communication continues to develop. For example, 76% of the investors who completed our survey reported that they have heard of CAMs, and it was about 60% in 2020. Also from the investor survey, when asked in an open-ended survey prompt about how CAM could be made more useful, some investors suggested that the auditor could use more specific language in their communication of the critical audit matters. Finally, we found no evidence of significant or systematic unintended consequences associated with the CAM requirements. Here, audit committee chairs and financial statement preparers reported generally smooth experience with their auditors' implementation of the requirement. I think this is likely due to the upfront preparation by the auditors, as all participating firms in our outreach, they told us that they developed infrastructure and conducted training to support the implementation of the CAM requirement by their audit engagement teams. Again, the goal of the CAM communication is to make the auditor report more relevant to investor and other financial statement user. With these findings from the interim analysis, the board in the report reminding auditor that they must communicate in their audit report all matters relating to the audit of the current period's financial statements, which meet the definition of a critical audit matter under AS 3101. As stated in the standard, it is expected that in most audits, the auditor would determine that at least one matter involved especially challenging, subjective, or complex auditor judgment. The board emphasized that today's challenging and rapidly changing macroeconomic environment might cause some audit areas to become increasingly challenging, subjective, or complex, which in turn may result in the communication of additional CAMs. Also, in communicating CAMs, the board reminded auditors that the intent of CAM is to provide information about the audit that would be useful to investors and financial statement users, and that auditors should therefore provide audit-specific information. Additionally, as a next step, the staff plans to work with the PCAOB investor advocate to explore opportunities to further increase investor familiarity with the critical audit matters so that investors are able to make use of the information available within that communications. This concludes the part of our presentation on the CAM interim analysis. Let me hand over to Carrie next, and she will provide you with an update on our interim analysis on the estimates and the specialist requirement. Thank you.
Thanks, Wei, and thank you to the advisory group for having us today. I'll go ahead and proceed on to the estimates and specialists section of the presentation. But before we jump into our interim analysis on estimates and specialists and our findings, let me go ahead and provide a brief refresher on the content of these new requirements. So the requirements for auditing accounting estimates, including fair value measurements, establish a uniform risk-based approach to auditing accounting estimates, and they strengthen requirements under pre-existing substantive testing approaches. I'll refer to these as the estimates requirements for short. The requirements emphasize application of professional skepticism, including addressing potential management bias in accounting estimates. The requirements also provide more direction on addressing certain aspects unique to auditing fair values of financial instruments, including the use of pricing information from third parties, such as pricing services and brokers or dealers. The requirements for auditors' use of the work of specialists strengthen requirements for evaluating the work of a company's specialist, whether employed or engaged by the company, and they apply a risk-based supervisory approach to both auditor-employed and auditor-engaged specialists. I'll refer to these as the specialist requirements for short. The requirements are risk-based so that the auditor's work effort to evaluate a specialist's work is commensurate with 1, the significance of the specialist's work to the auditor's conclusion regarding the relevant assertion, 2, the risk of material misstatement of the relevant assertion, 3, the knowledge, skill, and ability of the specialist, and 4, the company's specialist's relationship to the company. These requirements came into effect for audits of fiscal years ending on or after December 15th of 2020. They were put in place in the wake of quite persistent deficiencies that were observed in inspections, and as well as the increasing importance and growth of complex accounting estimates and fair value measurements in financial reporting. And then along with that, the related use of the work of specialists. So that's the overview of what these requirements entail. I'll tell you now a little bit about our interim analysis. So our objective for this interim analysis was to evaluate the initial impacts of the estimates requirements and the specialist requirements. Similarly to the CAMS analysis, we approached this interim analysis by performing stakeholder outreach and by conducting large sample statistical analysis. The statistical analysis focused on PCAOB inspection data on specialist usage at the issuer level. And one thing that I want to note up front about our stakeholder outreach is that many audit firms ended up implementing both sets of requirements together, and they were not able to provide us with disaggregated data on the separate effects of each one. This was largely due to the fact that the requirements had the same effective date and due to the interrelated nature of these two sets of requirements. In cases where we were able to present disaggregated findings and where we found that there was a distinct impact made by one or the other of the estimates requirements or the specialist requirements, we included those findings in our report separately based on whichever requirement they applied to. But otherwise, we presented our analysis on a combined basis throughout the report. So that's just something to keep in mind as I present our results. In the stakeholder outreach on estimates and specialists, we had a few goals. The first thing was that we sought to understand the initiatives that audit firms put in place to support implementation of the requirements, along with the associated costs of implementation and any challenges that they encountered. Second, we sought to assess how the new estimates requirements and specialist requirements impacted individual audits, including any implications for audit quality. Third, we also sought to identify any potential for disproportionate impacts on smaller audit firms. We wanted to monitor this possibility since it was a potential outcome that was recognized in the rulemaking release. Fourth, we performed work to understand issuer experiences with initial implementation of the new requirements. And then finally, we sought to provide an opportunity for all other interested stakeholders, including investors and others that we didn't reach out to through our direct data collection activities, with an avenue to provide input if that was something that they wanted to do. And then once again, similarly to our work on CAMs, we conducted several different outreach activities that allowed us to gather information to meet these objectives. We sent out a questionnaire to 18 audit firms, and we received back 17 complete responses. We were then able to interview 31 audit engagement partners from those firms. We also interviewed 21 audit committee chairs and preparers from selected audit engagements. And then finally, we issued a public request for comment, and we received back 14 comment letters in response to that. In our large sample statistical analysis, our objective was to monitor any changes in specialist usage that were observable in PCAOB inspection data. So PCAOB inspectors collect data on specialist usage for all inspected engagements, such as whether an engagement team used one or more specialists, the type of specialists that they used, and the amount of hours that those specialists spent on the audit. Our statistical analysis leveraged this information in assessing any change in specialist usage before and after the new specialist requirements took effect. And just as a quick aside, here I will note that the focus of our statistical analysis is on the new specialists requirements. The new estimates requirements, on the other hand, which are the other half of our interim analysis here, emphasize that auditors need to apply professional skepticism, including addressing potential management bias when auditing accounting estimates. And given the lack of structured and systematic data that's currently available to measure these emphases specifically, we were unable to separately perform a large sample statistical analysis to evaluate the initial impact of the new estimates requirements at this time. But that being said, we do plan to continue to monitor research related to the new estimates requirements and to examine any potential data that might be used for future large sample empirical analyses. So what did we find? Overall, as compared to CAMs, which really required a fundamental change to the audit report, the estimates and specialist requirements are much more incremental in nature, relating to the audit process itself. And I think our staff analysis really bears out the incremental nature of these requirements. The main takeaway thus far from our initial work on estimates and specialists is that we did find some positive impacts of the new requirements on auditors and their clients, although these impacts tend to be more marginal in nature and engagement specific. First, from the auditor outreach, some auditors reported that the new requirements improved auditing practices. And among those auditors that reported an impact, some common themes included that the engagement team had an increased focus on the risks of material misstatement within components of accounting estimates, and that there was improved coordination between the audit engagement team and the auditor specialists. Other auditors reported that the effects of the new requirements were limited and did not significantly change how engagement teams conducted audits. And these audit firms and engagement partners that gave us this type of feedback generally asserted that their prior policies and practices largely already aligned with the new requirements. We also heard that some of these auditors used the implementation year as an opportunity, firstly, to remind engagement teams of their responsibilities when auditing accounting estimates, and then secondly, to refresh dialogue around practical strategies for more effective and efficient collaboration between engagement teams and auditor specialists. So these refresher initiatives may in turn have also improved the quality of audits at these firms. In terms of implementation costs, we found significant variation in the amount of time that was spent by audit firms, both in supporting implementation of the new requirements and in training their personnel. Large firms generally updated their methodologies themselves, while smaller firms generally implemented the revisions via updates to methodologies that were sourced from third-party vendors. At the audit engagement level, almost all firms and audit engagement partners reported that the new requirements did not result in significant increases to audit hours or a significant increase in audit fees. And in fact, the majority of engagement partners that we interviewed estimated that the additional time spent that was related to the new requirements was not substantial. In general, less than 1% of total audit hours. And additionally, none of the partners that we interviewed reported increasing audit fees due to the new requirements. In terms of our statistical analysis, we saw some evidence of increased specialist usage and of increased specialist usage earlier in the audit process, meaning that specialist hours were more likely to occur during the planning stage of the audit process. And then finally, we found no evidence of significant unintended consequences associated with the implementation of these new requirements. We did hear that some smaller firms and their issuer clients encountered some constraints in the pool of available specialists, but these firms generally attributed the constraints to environmental factors, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and merger and acquisition activity, rather than to the new specialist requirements. Wei, can you move it to the next slide? And then to just go ahead and wrap up the presentation today, let me quickly talk about what's next to come for post-implementation reviews. First, we plan to continue to monitor the implementation of the CAM requirements and the estimates and specialist requirements, and we will evaluate the scope and timeline for any future analyses. And then, in addition to our work on CAMs and estimates and specialists, we've also started thinking about other future projects. We are currently planning for a post-implementation review of the recently adopted requirements on supervision of other auditors, which will become effective in 2024. And we will consider adding additional PIR projects as other new or amended standards are approved. And then finally, we also have a few questions for discussion today, and we're very interested in hearing your thoughts and perspectives on them. I will go ahead and read through all the questions and then open the floor for any comments. So firstly, as discussed in an earlier part of the presentation, the staff plans to work with the PCAOB investor advocate to explore opportunities to further increase investor familiarity with CAMs and to gather further input on their perceptions and the usefulness of CAM communications. And in your opinion, firstly, what investor groups should we focus on soliciting feedback from? As Wei mentioned earlier, in our two previous interim analyses, we have focused on investors who conduct fundamental or governance analysis of companies, since these investors are more likely to have read CAMs. And then next, how can we build up a list of relevant investor contacts? Up to this point, we have relied on both external and internal sources to identify potential respondents to our surveys. These include lists of financial professionals that are maintained by external research vendors, as well as an internal list of contacts based on prior comment letters received during rulemakings. Then, what types of outreach are investors more likely to respond to? And what types of outreach will provide the most useful input? For example, surveys, interviews, focus group discussions. Thus far, we've been conducting web-based surveys to gather data on investors' awareness, perceptions, and use of CAMs. We're interested in your thoughts on our use of surveys and whether there are other potential platforms to reach out to investors and obtain information regarding CAMs. And then also more generally, what additional analyses beyond those that have been presented in these published interim analysis reports might the staff consider? And then our second topic relates to the new requirements for supervision of other auditors. And we'd like to know if you have observed any changes in auditing practices in anticipation of the effective date. And if yes, what are your views on the potential implications of these changes for audit quality? And I'd like to note for this question that we're aware that the revised requirements for group audits under IAASB's ISA 600 will also become effective around the same time as the PCAOB requirements. So any observed changes could be due to preparation for compliance with both sets of requirements. But any perspectives you have, either separately or jointly, for these two sets of requirements would be helpful to us. And with that, I will stop here and open the floor for discussion on these questions or others. And thank you for your time.
We can start with Preeti.
Morning, thank you. Wei, I have a question for you. Has your team looked at the difference between the CCAMs and the KCAMs, specifically firms that disclose both, and why there are differences in what firms are disclosing under the two regimes? Like what's driving that in terms of the rulemaking and in terms of the consequences as well?
Thanks, Preeti, for that question. So I think, first of all, the definition for CCAM and KCAM are different. They're similar, but they're not identical. So I think to some extent, some level of the differences are expected. In terms of the analysis, I think, as we said in the interim analysis report, we were thinking about, what we'll be kind of monitoring what's being reported on the KCAM, but we don't really have analysis to kind of look into the really detailed difference between the two. But thanks for the comment and suggestion. Maybe that's something we can consider for future, but right now we don't have that analysis.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful because I think it's helpful to understand whether those differences are intended or not, right? Because I know the rules are different, but should they be different and are people behaving and responding the way you want them to? I think that would be helpful.
Thanks.
Next, Jennifer Joe.
Good morning. Thank you, Wei, for your presentation. As a casual observer, I am surprised and disappointed, actually, that the number of CAMs are decreasing rather than increasing. It just seems to me that business risk and the complexity of audits are increasing. And so I see this as a major disconnect. Wondering whether you have done or considered any work on doing look back analysis to see if there is an under-reporting of CAMs. For example, when there are restatement issues, are they related to, if a company has issued a restatement, is it related to a risk area? When there is a major revision in an analyst forecast or company forecast, is it related to a risk that was discussed in CAM? When a company has a significant loss due to climate conditions, was that addressed as a risk issue? Just, these are just some initial thoughts on items that we can look to do a look back analysis and say, here's a risk that presented itself and altered financial reporting. Was this risk addressed during the audit and in the CAMs?
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Jeff Mahoney.
Thank you. Appreciate the analysis. I want to first say I support Professor Chowdhury's view about looking at the KCAMs and the CAMs and why they're different, and specifically what aspect of the standards create that difference. I think that would be very helpful. I think, as the professor suggested, that might be, in some people's views, evidence of a significant unintended consequence of the standard. Let me just throw out respectfully a second challenge to your conclusion that there's no evidence of significant unintended consequences. And that goes back to something I mentioned at the last meeting. Paragraph 14 of the standard states that for each critical audit matter communicated in the auditor's report, the auditor must. And paragraph C, C of paragraph 14, asks the auditor to describe how the critical audit matter was addressed in the audit. And there's a note to C, subparagraph C, that describes at least four different ways an auditor might provide that disclosure about how the matter was addressed. Item 3 in that paragraph states an indication of the outcome of the audit procedures. And item 4 in that paragraph states key observations with respect to the matter. I I mention those two because those two, items 3 and 4, are consistent with the types of disclosures that many investors requested that CAMs provide in connection with the development of the standard. So I have not reviewed all the CAMs that have been issued. I have reviewed more than 100 of them. And I know that's a small subset of all of them, but when I reviewed them, I did not find any CAMs that included disclosures along the lines indicated in item 3 and 4 of subparagraph C. So I just question, isn't it evidence of a significant unintended consequence if two of the disclosures that many investors wanted to see in CAMs do not appear to be provided by the CAMs that we've seen to date? Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Brian Croto.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe a few things. I wanted to go back to, well, first, as a firm, my firm did participate in the survey process, and really appreciate kind of the way in which the staff approached, not only working with auditors, but I think broad constituents in gathering information and data, and really trying to drill in on the CAM implementation and understand the effectiveness of it. And all in all, I think we can step back and there's a lot to be proud of here as a profession and for the PCAOB relative to the way this was implemented. I do give a lot of credit as well to the interactions we were able to have through the CAQ as a profession with the PCAOB in advance of implementation and guidance and the like the PCAOB did issued, which I think led to a better implementation than otherwise would have potentially seen. And I think some could have been disappointed.
Brian, we're having trouble hearing you. You sound garbled.
Too bad.
Brian.
Let me see if I can take care of that. I'm not sure exactly how to. Is this any better?
Yes.
Okay. So just carrying on, I was saying that I believe some of the success
Brian, your mic problems are back.
I think what's happening is you're getting reverb from talking quickly and it goes back and forth. So I don't know if you have a headset or something you can put on.
I'll call back in using this.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll come back to you. David Fabricant.
Yes, hi, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Just two questions on CAM's way. I think you said that you interviewed 43 audit committee chairs. I'm curious to know if you interviewed any preparers, or if you considered the audit committee chairs the preparers. And the second question is a little bit of a look back one as well. I think you will find that most CAMs have a direct correlation to critical accounting estimates and those disclosures in the annual financial statements. And I wonder if you have examples where maybe that wasn't the correlation, or were critical accounting estimates either newly added or significantly modified as a result of a CAM being disclosed for the first time in the auditor's report. I think that could be an unintended positive outcome. I also think it probably could have maybe showed some deficiencies in the critical accounting estimates that maybe should have been disclosed that weren't, and the CAMs produced a different outcome.
Thank you, David. Maybe I can quickly respond to that. So first of all, we did interview financial statement preparers. So it was a total number of 43 between the ACCs and preparers. And second question, we don't really have a large sample analysis on that, but from the interview, I think some of the preparer would was telling us that they didn't really make much changes in their company disclosure because of the CAM. But again, it's from the interview, we don't have a really kind of large sample analysis on that. But thank you for that comment.
If I could just jump in real quick on that one way, and Carrie, feel free to jump in here as well. we did, as part of our engagement partner survey, ask engagement partners whether issuers made changes to their financial statement disclosures or other corporate reporting because of CAMs. And I think it was approximately 25% of the engagement partners that we interviewed. And again, that was a total of almost 2,000 engagement partners over the course of the two surveys that did make that comment. To Wei's point, as part of the interviews with the preparers, several preparers did say that they compared their disclosures to critical audit matters, although none of them reported making significant changes to those disclosures. So we did come at that question through a couple of different ways.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Brian, I see your mic, you're back. So let's see if it works now. Now we can't hear you at all. Are you muted?
Oh yeah, double muted. Okay, there we go. How about now?
Great.
Great. So yeah, so first of all, I was really congratulating the staff on the way I think you've done the post-implementation review, the not only with reaching out to firms through the survey process and the level of granularity, but a broad group of constituents. You've gathered a lot of good data and information. So really, appreciate the way that's been approached. And as a firm, my firm certainly did participate in that, as many of the others on the call here today, I'm sure. And I guess one thing I would say that might have been disappointing to some, and maybe is disappointing, was just, that really only half of investors had ever seen CAMs, or only three quarters had heard of them on the one hand. On the other hand, I will say, and I think you were just talking about this in terms of the focus by companies on their disclosures, management on their disclosures, having been deeply involved in the implementation at my firm, and thinking about all of the work we did leading up to the year before, sort of dry runs and the like, I can tell you for sure there were many companies who thought more carefully and looked more carefully at their disclosures in areas where we would potentially have CAMs, and there were disclosures that were enhanced as a result of the incremental attention that was likely to be given to those disclosures as a result of the CAMs. And I know that wasn't the purpose per se of CAM reporting, but to the extent that we did see improvement or more transparency in management disclosure around the areas that are most challenging, subjective, or complex in performing our work, I think that's there is a benefit to that, all in the context of the existing financial reporting framework, which is important as well. So I think that it's maybe hard to measure that. And I know you sought to receive some of that information to the extent companies did that a year in advance, or to the extent that maybe they didn't view the change as significant, notwithstanding it's incremental and maybe helpful. It might have been hard to really fully get at that information and really appreciate that there were really enhancements to company disclosure, and I saw that firsthand. Then I was just going to add that as I think about the success of this and our ability through the CAQ as a profession to engage during the implementation and then the guidance that was issued in advance, I mean, I think there's a lot, the profession, the PCAOB, there's a lot to be proud of here relative to the way I think this standard was implemented. I think the other auditor standard, and presumably eventually when the board finalizes the QC standard, I can see those as being standards where similar type approaches with the ability to have engagement perhaps through the CAQ and for any guidance that might be appropriate to be put out, I think would be very beneficial to successful implementation of future standards as well. So I just wanted to give credit to what happened from a CAM perspective, but also encourage that type of ability to communicate and dialogue as we're working to implement future standards, given how I think important that was to the effectiveness on these. And then the last thing I'll just say on other auditors is that I think it's wise to keep in mind the point that was made about us implementing 600R, ISO 600R at the same time, and that they do have the same or similar effective dates. And so we are working to do that. I don't personally have a lot to say relative to seeing early effects of pre-implementation sort of, before the effective date. marginally, there are things, sure, that I think teams may be doing as they look ahead to what's coming in terms of the implementation, but I think that's probably marginal versus the true incremental efforts that will occur as firms develop and implement their changes to the methodology and conduct the training around the implementation of the standards. So I don't think that there's a lot to speak of yet, at least from my perspective, in terms of early returns of seeing something that was done in advance. So wanted to add that as well. Thank you.
Jim Hunt.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this really excellent set of reporting on the on post-implementation. About the pre-implementation time of CAMs being discussed, there was a skeptical and perhaps some would say cynical view that this was going to lead to a direct path from the plaintiff's bar and regulatory considerations and concerns. And your unintended consequences suggest that that didn't happen. So I think that's a good thing. And I just wondered if you saw any evidence of that didn't rise to the level that you're expecting, or that there was just no evidence of it at all. Thanks.
We think that's, thank you for the comment. And we did not specifically look into any litigation arising because of the CAM, but that's something we plan to do in the PIR, which is will be coming out in future years as well, because we always feel like litigation will be a longer term effect. That's why in these two more recent period interim analysis, we did not look into that, but that's something we'll be keeping an eye on.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dane Mott.
Thanks very much. A few comments. I'll start with Preeti's comment about, KCAMs versus CCAMs. Like, we are seeing more disclosures on the KCAM side, and if you're an investor, it's kind of weird that you have to go to different filings to get more information. So that says to me that the standard is the trigger is too tight on the CCAM side. Like, we need to, if it's a lower standard for disclosure with KCAMs, move to that lower standard, because more information is more helpful. The fact that we're getting 1 to 2 CAMs per company, at least from a fundamental analysis perspective, doesn't make much sense to me, because companies aren't one-dimensional. There's always going to be more than one key thing, if you're investing in those companies, that are going to be important. And, I would assume the same thing is on the audit side. The fact that we've seen incrementally fewer CAMs disclosed by companies is sad, but the cynic in me is not surprised by that either, though, because I think often with disclosure, it becomes a race to the bottom. Companies are benchmarking against their competitors, and they wait to see what disclosures come out from their competitors. And if they see that their competitors were able to get by with more legalese, less disclosure, and they don't get any kind of slap on the wrist for it, then that tells the others in the system that they can do the same. So you get less disclosure the next round. And, so that's kind of how we see disclosure work from an investor perspective. Jeff's point's a really important one, that, maybe there are aspects of this standard that are being ignored, because, we're not seeing the disclosures, to the particular parts that he mentioned. There was a question that you folks had about, you're trying to target fundamental investors and governance specialists. Are those the right people? I think I would focus more on the fundamental investors personally, because those are the ones who are really going to be able to tell you if they're deep in the company and specialists in the company. They can look at the CAMs and then say, well, hey, when I'm investing in this company, these are other key issues that we don't see showing up in the CAMs that are key issues for these companies. That's kind of where I think your most value add is going to be. And then lastly, you had a question about, like, how can you pick up more investor input? If there's any opportunity for partnership with the FASB, I would reach out to Chandy Smith and Jeff Brickman, who are the investor liaisons at the FASB. My guess is it's going to be the same folks that you're going to want to talk to, are the same folks that they've been talking to for decades and have built up their Rolodex. And if nothing else, they could send out a mass email to their distribution list and ask, like, hey, would you be okay if, folks from the PCAOB reach out to you and, start talking to you? And, that would kind of seem to be low-hanging fruit if the two organizations can partner together. So thanks.
Thank you.
Keisha Williams-Smith.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I just had something quick because I know we are getting close to time, but some of the earlier comments talked about, the disappointment with the number of CAMs, even the prior comment by Dane. One thought in terms of additional analyses, I think what we're hearing is maybe we need to do a completeness check. Is everything that should be in a CAM in a CAM? And I know this in a post-implementation review might not be your direct point, but it could be that you can use some external databases to look at the CAMs that are reported and then maybe compare to those critical accounting policies just to get a sense. Are we really, really far off from what's being reported? I know the standard is written very tightly, but it might just give you some additional insight that there might be maybe a short, distance between the CAMs and the critical accounting policies, or a wide distance, and just to give you some additional insight. And so from an additional analysis perspective, because everything has been surveys and interviews and things of that nature, which are helpful, but that's really coming from people self-reporting. And so it might be helpful to do an external type of evaluation, just basically looking at external databases that are separate from self-reporting. So that is one point of consideration. And then I also put in the chat, which I think we heard a little bit earlier, just comparing and benchmarking to other standard setters. The KCAM side, they have their own PIR just to evaluate consistencies or disconnects, just to inform the go-forward process for the PCAOB. So thank you for this time.
Sandy Peters. Sandy, I think you're muted.
I took my hand down. I didn't take myself off on mute. Sorry. I'm so glad I get to follow Keisha because my comments are pretty much in the same vein. I agree with the comments that she made with respect to completeness, because I think the greatest information content from these CAM disclosures may be what's not there, right? To investors. And we actually, several years ago when they first came out, we compared the CAMs to the top 10 issues from comment letters for the SEC. And they were there, but the one item, 9 of the top 10 were in the CAMs, but the one that wasn't was segments, right? So the SEC was asking a lot of questions about segments, but segments wasn't a CAM. And people are like, well, segments are complicated. Segments are very complicated, right? Lots of estimates, lots of judgments, lots of management flexibility, right? So that relative to other things that are discussed about the company are also particularly important. As we've seen in the last couple of weeks, a lot of investors have looked at the CAMs of the institutions which have had troubles and said the most important risk was not disclosed, right? So I think what's not there is going to be very important to consider in a more complete post-implementation review. And I think Jeff's comments are particularly important with respect to findings. And when you I pulled up the actual report that you guys issued in December, and in the last paragraph, it says that more detailed language and what the outcomes were is important. And I think that's really the bottom line for us as investors. Is it's great to know that you dabbled in this area, but what'd you find, right? Is sort of the place where investors come from. And I would tell you also that when we did an analysis of CCAMs versus KCAMs several years ago, we actually found companies that were dual listed and would have 2 KCAMs, but when they came to the US and filed their opinion here, they had 1, right? So they're taking them out. And so there was actually a difference with regard to what was actually disclosed in what marketplace because of that. And I'm not sure that investors think that's what should happen. So that may be something that needs to be considered in how the standard is written here and when you file in 2 different locations. I think feedback on estimates and specialists and other auditors is hard because investors see none of that, right? So getting their feedback is going to be next to impossible. They don't know that that's going on or that's changed or what the consequence to them actually is. I think Dane's comments with respect to the feedback from from investors is and sort of leveraging the work of the FASB is a good comment. I would say that, you know, I think the recent events have showed us that the vast majority of America's corporations are owned by passive funds, and people aren't doing price discovery. They're assuming someone else does, right? So recognition, disclosure is not a substitute for appropriate recognition and measurement. And there's a lot of investors not reading CAMs because they don't read the financial statements. And I think that's an important consideration when you think about who you outreach to and how important it is that we have market participants who do review the financial statements. So I think I'm in agreement with a lot of what's been said.
Thanks, Sandy. So we're over time. So I just want to take the rest of the hands that are up. And so that's John Lakomnik, Robert Nickel, John White, Lynn Turner, Sarah Lord, Jennifer Burns, and Steve Morrison. So John Lakomnik, you're next.
I will make it fast then. I would second what Sandy and Keisha and Dane and Jeff said. I also just have a question. One of the issues with any sort of cost-benefit analysis is that the costs are easily measurable, right? I mean, there's a limited number of people who are bearing the cost. The benefit is trust in the system and belief that audit quality is improving. And that is both amorphous and spread among a much larger universe. So it's much harder to manage. And I heard none of that discussed in the PIR. And so can you just tell me how the process takes into account that major issue, which is you're doing all this to ensure a trustworthy reporting system, and do you somehow measure whether or not any of this seems to increase people's belief that the financial statements are more trustworthy?
Thank you, John. So I think our review starts with the economic analysis set forth in the adopting release. So we follow the benefit discussion and cost discussion there very closely. So again, the main benefit here is to inform investors. So we follow the commonly used measure in the literature to look at the benefit side of the standard. So it's a very interesting good point that you raised about the trust. We don't have a good measurement for that, but you know, we will continue to monitor the literature to see if there's any quantitative measure for us to use in the model. Thanks for the comment.
Okay, because the econometric literature sort of says trust is an economic equivalent of a lubricant, that it makes everything work a lot faster, better, more efficiently. So if you'll just keep that in mind, it would be great. Thank you.
Robert Nickel, I saw your hand was up. Did you put it down?
I thought we were going to run out of time, so I took it down. But if you're extending, yes. I'm sitting here with a certain sense of irony because literally last night, I was talking to the technical director of one of the big 6 firms in Australia, and he was complaining and asking me why do the U.S. side of some dualistic companies get away with fewer CAMs with a C. So, I mean, we've heard that comment a few times. It was interesting to put it in the context of what I just heard from an international technical partner. But I also wanted to mention something that I'm sure the economists on the call know, but I haven't heard much reference to the large-scale existing research on this topic. If you ask people, do they want more information, you can pretty much be sure they're going to say, yes, of course we do. The proof, so to speak, is how that information actually gets produced, which creates a cost, and how it gets used, which creates a benefit. And the large-scale studies out there mostly show that the market doesn't seem to pay much attention to this information, which leads to a whole other question, which is why? Why? Now, we heard one possible answer that half of investors don't even know what a CAM is, which in itself is kind of bothersome. But I just want to point out that, in fact, there is a research project out of all places, Paris, that's looked at using machine learning has looked at CAMs in the United States. And they're finding that if you look at over time, meaning one company over time or one company within its industry using machine learning, there's actually a lot of information in those CAMs that can be discerned. But what comes out is most of them look like each other. Right? There's a certain boilerplate effect that's occurring. Basically, it literally takes machine learning to tease out where the differences might actually be. So I don't know if the economics group has thought about looking at this, but one thing I would propose, because this I think was raised already, somebody suggested this, and it was nice for me to hear this from someone more in the practice world, that is there in fact the benefit, the spill-on effect of the companies, including improving their own disclosures, such that the CAMs are maybe the cause, but not the observable outcome that is actually creating the benefits. And so I would encourage that. But again, that's not something you can necessarily obtain or contribute to an interview or a survey. Thank you.
Thank you.
John White.
Can you hear me? Okay. Just quickly agreeing with a variety of the comments that are made. I like Jennifer Joe's comment of looking at places where companies have problems and then looking back to see if those correlate with CAMs that they've reported. I like David Fabricant's suggestion that you should be in your process talking with preparers as well as audit committee chairs. I think they come at things from a different perspective and they would be useful to you. I like Brian Croto's comment. I feel like I live it in my practice that CAMs or the process of the auditor developing them is improving related disclosure. The companies really are enhancing their disclosure around an area that is a CAM. And I guess finally, just as a governance lawyer, I must say that I frequently am asked to advise where accounting and auditing problems come up at a company. And one of the first things I go to do is see if there's a CAM on the issue. And I'm really quite surprised how often there is one that is obviously is an early warning, I guess I would say. Obviously, the CAM doesn't provide that much detail. You go into work, you do a lot of work on it afterwards. But I do think that it is providing a useful signal, early warning to investors. Sorry to be so fast, but those are just general observations.
Thanks, John. Lynn Turner.
Just real quick, I'd echo the comments from those such as Sandy and Jeff and Dane. I have done a study of about 20 companies and looked at both their US and their foreign reports, and there is a noticeable difference. I have the concern that Brian mentioned about investors perhaps not looking at the CAMs, but I got a different perspective on that, in that the investors I've talked to who have looked at them, in some instances have found the information isn't worthwhile to read, that they're very boilerplate, very generic, especially versus the foreign CAMs, and I find the same problem. And so we actually may be creating a problem here in that, again, there's just not a value to the investor of taking the time to reading the report. I have seen some CAMs that were very good, excellent, but they were far from a boilerplate situation. But I'd have to say that's not the majority. And so that also brings up another question. I know the PCAOB has done an inspection of one of the large firms and found about 15% of the audits, the firm was not compliant with the professional standard on audit reports, and specifically with respect to the language on CAMs. And my question for Erica, if Erica is still with us, is, without naming any companies or giving any details, has the PCAOB yet to initiate any investigations into CAMs? I couldn't find one on the website, but I'm not sure I saw everything. So I guess that's a question for Erica.
Hyland, thanks for the question. So we're precluded from talking about any investigations or enforcement matters, as I know you know, so I won't be able to do that. However, I will say that this CAMS is absolutely a focus for us, both in our inspections and enforcement, and that as was communicated by Michael and Wei and others, this is an area that is of concern to the board, and that's one of the reasons why we put out specific reminders in our interim analysis report and in our 2021 inspections observations. But generally, with respect to enforcement, know that we are focused on all standards, and any failure to comply with them, including the CAM standard, is one that we won't hesitate to bring in enforcement action related to that.
If I could just jump in real quick as well on the question then on whether investors find CAMs useful and whether it's worth their time to look at them. We did look into that. It's a bit of a mixed bag. We had an open-ended question within our survey, and 24 investors responded to this that asked them to share 2 reasons why they would or would not use CAMs in the future. And of those 24, 17 of the 24 investors said they would use CAMs in the future, and they said that they generally found the CAMs helpful to identify critical reporting risks and to provide a basis for questions to management. Now, the 7 that said that they wouldn't added that they do not add more information to what's already disclosed in other parts of the financial report, or said that they lack specificity. So we did look into that. We saw a bit of a mixed bag when we asked the question.
Thanks, Mike. Sarah Lord.
Hi, thank you. Just one item, as I'm listening to the conversation, I think if I captured it correctly, when we talk about the decrease in CAMs, it was like a 1.6 to 1.4 for large accelerated filers, like a 1.2 to 1.1 for non-large accelerated filers. And so I guess I just would wonder, is that statistically significant? It's a decrease, but is it enough that we should be worried that we're actually seeing a race to the bottom, or is it kind of a first piece of evidence that is important and is something to be careful about, but maybe isn't a takeaway theme that we should be worried about at this point?
So thank you, Sarah. So it is statistically significant, the difference that we see there. And, we only have 3 years of data for LAF, and we're actually collecting the 4th year of data right now. So I think we need a longer period of time to actually look at a trend. But, just very quickly to respond to that, it is statistically significant in terms of those drops that we're seeing.
Thank you.
Jennifer Burns.
Thanks, Jessica. Appreciate all the comments, and I just had a couple of quick thoughts. One is, in the post-implementation review, I was expecting to see some commentary about the inspection results, and I don't see that in there, so I would hope that these 2 efforts are related and intertwined, and I think that's some of the themes that you're hearing from the commentary, is whether, we saw that auditors were meeting the requirements of the standards. So that's one thought I wanted to share. And then secondly, there was an open question as to whether the IAASB is doing their own post-implementation review, and yes, they are. So the PCAOB might want to be talking with their counterparts at the IAASB and sharing information. And then also, lastly, to the commentary about different results outside of the US and in the US, we have to remember that the requirements are actually different and the language is different. So we shouldn't be surprised that there is a different outcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, Steve, you have the last word before lunch.
I know, and so I'll try and keep my comments to under 2 hours for everybody. So, but I'll keep it quick. I appreciate all the comments, and I appreciate all the effort that went into this, and I'm in agreement with various items that people said, particularly what Brian Croto was pointing out in terms of kind of focusing the auditor's efforts, and maybe some issuers were a little more focused on some of the disclosures. But and kind of to dovetail or to expand on, I should say, what Jennifer was just saying, that I do know that a lot of firms had 1B comments on the documentation related to CAMs. One of the comments also made a little bit earlier about the costs being easily identifiable. I'm not sure I'm necessarily in agreement with that, because there is a lot of time and effort, particularly with documentation. And although I do think that there has been some benefits from CCAMs, I do question I think this should be a part of the overall post-implementation review, not just to stand back on should we refine these, is this being implemented correctly, but really their existence altogether. Some of the investment community really wants it. I'd like to hear that, but I'm hearing kind of mixed results. And then there was also a comment made about if someone does not read the financial, they're just looking at the report. I don't think that should really drive our the standard setting and our implementation of this, because people really should be reading the actual financials. And it's my personal view, and this is not speaking behalf of anybody, if something is especially challenging, subjective, or complex, it really should be called attention to in the financial statements themselves. Hey, this fair value was very hard for management to come up with, and they had to think through it a lot. Or this impairment analysis was very subjective, and so forth. I know we're pointing to having these items in the auditor's report, but we're 1.4 instead of 1.6 CAMs. You could put 10 CAMs on there. There's still a lot more than 10 risks of material misstatements. So it's not just those CAMs are not the only event that are there. So I think we have this that's out there, and if it's useful for investors, I think this is not the only thing that's out there. So I think that the post-implementation review, not just what you're seeing from inspections and what the investor feedback is, but also taking a step back and saying, are we possibly leading people to think that these were the only issues that were really there, and kind of taking away from the fact that the whole audit, that there could be really hundreds of risks of material misstatement. And obviously there are different gradations and higher risk and so forth, but those were my thoughts as I was going through this. And I realize it's a young standard, and there's a lot of knowledge and experience to be gained by auditors, preparers, and the investment community. But it's something I think we have to kind of keep in mind.
Thank you for that. Wanted to say two things. Well, first of all, thank you, Wade, Carrie, and Michael. We obviously underestimated all the great input we were going to get on this topic. So thank you to members. As I understand, a few members may have joined a little late or had some technical difficulties. So I did want to announce again that the board has approved the formation of a 5-member emerging issues and auditing subcommittee. And we will try to end the public meeting a little bit early and have a time period for either self-nominations or for you nominating others, and try to get those members elected today. I would like to be cognizant of the fact that we're quite a bit behind. So if it's possible, could we come back at 12:50 for lunch? We do recommend that you stay logged into the meeting, but please make sure to turn cameras off and put it on mute. And we'll look forward to seeing you again this afternoon to kick off our going concern discussion.